On the way to the art gallery, I unexpectedly fell asleep. When I woke up, I found myself leaning on Benjamin's shoulder. His eyes shut as if he was asleep as well, knowing he had mesophobia. I got up quickly and carefully smoothed the spot where I had just leaned against him to avoid irritating him when he woke up. But as soon as I leaned over, Benjamin opened his eyes. My posture appeared as if I was going to kiss him. I quickly bounced away like a spring. I wasn't going to kiss you. A hint of amusement flickered in his eye.
Do you know the saying the cover-up is worse than the crime?
I was left speechless, and before I could explain, Benjamin had already got off the car. I could only hurriedly open the door to catch up with him. Benjamin walked ahead with long strides, and I did my best to catch up with him. I took off my coat and handed it to him. It is mandatory for the boyfriend to hold his girlfriend's coat. To my surprise, Benjamin complied with my request. When I walked into the exhibition hall, I realized his compliance was just a farce. It was evidently so, as it was extremely cold in the exhibition hall, and I could not stop sneezing while wearing a sleeveless dress. I kept gesturing for Benjamin to put my coat on me, but I was completely ignored. It wasn't until we finally saw Closetta and her fiancé that Benjamin considerately put the coat on me when I sneezed again, saying,
"It's cold in the exhibition hall. Be careful not to catch a cold."
I watched as the perfect smile on Closetta disappeared. I could not help but lament to myself, Benjamin is a heartless boss. If I fell ill from the cold air, I will undoubtedly seek compensation for medical expenses from him. Soon, I realized that I had greatly underestimated Benjamin. His acting was far more impressive than I had anticipated. Throughout the opening ceremony, Benjamin was extremely gentle and caring for me in front of Closetta and her fiancé. He had even bent down to tie my shoelaces when they became loose, not to mention trivial things like opening bottle cap. But when he bent down, my entire back stiffened. It was so terrifying. This was Benjamin that we're talking about here. In my impression, he had always been an extremely arrogant person. When I first became his secretary, the former one left me hundreds of job tips. Things like Benjamin liked the temperature of his room at 25 degrees, the humidity at 56%, and his water had to be ice cold. I was totally shocked when I saw these tips. Was Benjamin a baby? Nevertheless, the former secretary made it clear that as Benjamin's secretary, it was my responsibility to ensure his utmost comfort, down to the smallest detail.
Mr. Jarrett pays you to do all of this,
she had said. Not only me, but all the staff around him were hired to ensure his comfort at every moment. Benjamin was a wealthy young man who had enough money to make everyone revolve around him and make him the center of attention, like a young prince who needed to be pampered. He could obtain anything he wanted with his wealth, except for Closetta. But now this man, who could have anything he desired, was bending down to tie my shoelaces just to get Closetta's attention and make her jealous. For the first time, I was jealous of Closetta. Meanwhile, Closetta, who knew nothing of their plan, gave me a complicated look. I was concerned that her jealousy would drive her to the point of madness. Alas, what a mess I have made, all for the sake of a little bit of money. I had to remind myself that I should not get caught up in this senseless competition among females. Benjamin had hired me only to make her jealous, and making money should be my top priority. Come on, Juliet, get yourself together. An unexpected gain of this trip was that I found Closetta's fiancé, Zachary, to be a rather interesting person. I noticed that when we bumped into each other at the same tray of Alaskan king crab at the buffet during lunchtime. In such a setting, socializing was more important than eating, and many skipped hard-to-eat dishes that hindered social interaction. Zachary and I looked at each other in surprise. The reason I felt at ease coming to eat was that I saw Closetta had the intention of catching up with Benjamin. After our earlier display of affection, I felt the need to give them the chance to be alone and for Benjamin to show a little concern for Closetta so that he could stand a chance with her. Otherwise, our display of affection to make Closetta jealous would have been in vain if she thought she had no chance with Benjamin at all and gave up on him completely. So when I saw Closetta approaching Benjamin, I excused myself, saying I had something to deal with. Before distancing myself from them, I cheered for Benjamin. Interestingly, Zachary remained unbothered about being replaced as Closetta's romantic interest, while he was devouring his plate of crab meat. Oblivious to the situation, he continued cracking jokes. As he looked at the lavish surroundings, he joked about his own financial status, saying that he was so pleased to meet me because we were both working class people struggling to make ends meet. At that moment, I found Zachary interesting. He was a dagfin, and humor seemed to be so ingrained in his very being. He could say anything to make people laugh. This was in stark contrast to Benjamin's lack of humor. I immediately understood why Closetta was drawn to Zachary, despite their different social background. Being in his company was much more enjoyable than being with Benjamin. Unfortunately, I only had a good laugh for no more than 15 minutes before a voice interrupted us.
What are the two of you talking about? You seem to be having a really good time.
Without realizing it, I turned my head and saw Benjamin and Closetta standing beside us. It was Closetta who spoke with a puzzled look. I glanced at Benjamin and wondered why they spent so little time catching up. Benjamin looked at me with a vague expression that I could not decipher. It was as though a pet owner had just found his lost dog. I couldn't quite comprehend what he was trying to convey. I answered Closetta politely. "We're just chatting. Mr. Sabot is so interesting." My words were as simple as they sounded, but their faces darkened upon hearing them. Closetta seemed a little awkward. Benjamin looked like a cat whose tail had been trampled on. All of a sudden, he took my hand and said,
We should get going.
Before Closetta could respond, I was dragged all the way out of the restaurant. My hand hurt from being clenched in his. When we left the restaurant, I released myself from his grip. Benjamin looked infuriated.
I'm not paying you to flirt with other men.
With that, he walked ahead alone. I was utterly confused by his sudden outburst. Deep down, I knew Benjamin was jealous of Zachary explaining the sharp edge to his word. Out of pity, I decided against arguing with him. I trailed behind and caught up to him. I took his arm, playing my part as his pretend girlfriend. After all, we had to pretend to be affectionate toward each other. However, he just pushed me away and said,
Reflect on your words and actions before you come to look for me.
This time, I didn't catch up to him. The second rule of being a corporate slave was to do as you were told and not just argue with your boss. Benjamin asked me to reflect, and so I obliged. Looking at his angry, retreating figure, I was sure Benjamin wouldn't wait for me to go home with him this time. Then could I just go back and continue to eat the king crab I hadn't finished just now?
Benjamin is like this. He can be stubborn like a child sometimes.
I turned around and found Closetta standing behind me. I patted my chest and said, "Oh, you've scared me to death, Miss Colosse. Why do you always appear from behind without a noise?" "Stubborn like a child," she said. There was no doubt that Closetta wanted to be seen as his ex-girlfriend. If I agreed with her, I was pretty sure she would say things to prove that she was the one who knew Benjamin best. I must not fall for her trick.